And now we come into our question and answer. I think we have about 20 minutes for this question and answers. And I'm getting help. We're getting help here from the the team. Some of the question has been curated because there's so many questions that coming. And the question, and uh, I will address this question to all the speakers just as we see on the screen. The question from Ms. Ardiani Triwastari, the Erlangga University, is as follows. I would like to address this question to all the presenters. What do you think about the policy where school give freedom for students to join or not join the national assessment, to take or not to take the national assessment, so voluntary, in order to reduce student stress toward national assessment and to avoid teaching to the test for teachers? Do you think this policy will improve the quality of data in the large-scale standardized assessment and the quality of national assessment itself? Would there be potential issues related to this practice? Thank you. So, Dr. Kilimangalam, maybe you have a take on this question first. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. I was just trying to think about this from the Indian perspective. I think the approach that we would prefer is to try to reduce the stakes in the assessment rather than give the student the choice. For a couple of reasons. One, I think the sampling exercise is complex enough without bringing in student choice to it. But a bigger problem would be that there are instances where, because the stakes are considered to be so high or considered potentially high, teachers often ask students not to come to the school on the day of the assessment. So it might become, rather than student choice, it might become teacher choice or school choice or principal's choice. And they may ask students who are not performing so well or who they don't expect to perform so well to opt not to take part in the assessment. So it really depends on how much student agency is present. If the choice is actually done by the student, then we might be able to build in practices to account for the sampling issues. But I suspect that what might end up happening is the choice may not actually be students, but someone else's, and that might lead to that would be a problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Yansi, maybe you have to take on this voluntary taking the exam.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think in Hong Kong, our schools or teachers have not such level of flexibility. The only case I can think of similarly is in the territory-wide system assessment. The school has an option for the primary 3 students. They can either select 10% of the students to join the assessment, or the whole level of the student to join the assessment. In that case, I don't think there are any big difference in terms of the reducing the student stress or the reducing the feeling of the school accountability, because no matter 10% or 100%, there will be data generated by the assessment, and that assessment data will be used for for some particular purposes. So I don't see any big difference. However, in a speculative perspective, if the school or teacher really get this freedom, my personal view is that opting out of this kind of national assessment might not be a wise move, because in Hong Kong's experiences, I think the system level assessment is actually a very high quality assessment. And the data generated by this kind of assessment can really be useful for schools improvement if they can use the data appropriately, okay, for the learning purpose rather than for the accountability purpose. So in my opinion, I think this is not the problem of national assessment. This is a problem about how we use the national assessment data, right? So this is my personal opinions.
Okay, thank you. Now, Dr. Colin, maybe you have a take on this, especially interested in your presentation in England. The test is consists of several different stages from year 1 to year 6. Now, if the student can be voluntarily opt to take or not to take the test, what do you think? Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously there is no a process in the UK for pupils to opt out of these assessments. Head teachers can make a decision to disapply the test if they think they're not appropriate for the child, but that wouldn't be something about stress. That would be about the attainment that the child has achieved. I mean, I think the purpose, it does come down to the purpose, doesn't it? And we are trying to make sure that the data is not used in an inappropriate way, which hopefully will reduce the stakes and therefore the way that schools behave. And we do send a lot of messages to schools about making sure that, that the mental health of children is one of the things that they have responsibility for, and that not to try to drive up the stress levels by talking all of the time about how important the tests are and so on. And indeed, for many of our assessments for particularly younger children, we try to make the sorts of tasks so that the children won't necessarily know that they are being formally assessed. They are just spending some time with their teacher doing some activities that will just feel like normal classroom practice. So obviously that changes the older the children get and the more formal the assessments become. But again, it's about giving schools the power to work on or to consider the mental health of children in the way that they're preparing them, rather than allowing children to not participate.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cullen. We're gonna move into the next question. If from the participants, but it is also interesting that I think if we opt, we give the student a choice to either take or not to take the test, then that might be students who feel well prepared taking the test, who are not well prepared not taking the test, resulted in a maybe a kind of almost like a biased sample that it's hard, especially in England, you report it at the national level and regional levels. I wonder if any of you have a take on this further question.
Sure. I think there's a slight reinterpretation here, in the sense that I think the overemphasis on pre-existing government machinery is not caused by lack of training. I think the lack of training is an effect of overemphasis and sort of a belief in the system, an assumption that the pre-existing government machinery is skilled enough, has the prerequisite skills to conduct the assessment. And that comes from conducting different assessments at this scale. So for example, different assignments at this scale, sorry. For example, there is a national census conducted every 10 years, and there are other such exercises, maybe the elections, etc., where teachers are involved. So because a lot of teachers and educational machinery would be involved in this exercise as well, the idea is that they would be able to handle it, but there are aspects of assessment that need to be the nuances that they need to be trained on, which then don't require, which don't receive the necessary focus. So it's more that the emphasizing the pre-existing government machinery sort of has this effect that sufficient assessment training is not provided, and sufficient robustness is not there in the actual administration.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to there many of us here also from Indonesia. Maybe you can a little bit elaborate what you mean by the machinery here. So,
Sure. Absolutely. So the idea is that, so for example, the census, right? The national census is conducted by the teachers, right? So they are, so teachers are the sort of are volunteered for tasks well beyond teaching. I think that might be true for other systems, but in India, it's a large issue that teachers are, other than teaching itself in the school, they are volunteered for other tasks. So the assumption is that the large workforce and other resources, government resources that are present, will be able or can be used for the purpose of the national assessment. And so the idea is that you can repurpose existing resources or personnel for these tasks, but insufficient training is provided, or there is insufficient awareness of what that repurposing means. So what is necessary for that repurposing to be successful. So you can't just ask someone who's been teaching in a classroom to just go conduct a standardized national assessment. You need to provide sufficient training. You need to provide the manuals, etc. The manuals are provided, and there is some amount of training, but it lacks the robustness necessary. And therefore, what happens is, due to the lack of awareness, sometimes there are, so for example, anecdotally, I'm aware of people there are very remote areas in India, especially in the mountains. And so there are people who say, oh, that's just, you can't get there in the time allotted, so I'm just going to choose my own alternate samples. It's not part of the alternate list of schools. So sometimes those kind of issues crop up. So that's those kind of issues is what you're referring to.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Watson, maybe you have a perspective on this using the machineries.
Yeah, we because it's a census assessment, it's what we're doing is sending everything out to the schools and getting them to administer. We then use our local authorities to monitor and to moderate the work of those schools, just to make sure that they are administering in a standardized way and making judgments for those teachers, those assessments that a teacher assessed. So we're just using those the usual structures there are in England to deliver the assessments and monitor them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Watson. Dr. Yancy, I'm sorry, I'm taking the liberty to address these interesting questions to you, which is from Ursula. Ursula, I cannot pronounce the name, Swantner. I'm sorry if I apologize if I mistakenly pronounce your name. The issue is interesting. That is particularly interested in the motivation for combining school-based assessment and standardized examinations. She understood that the main goal was to acknowledge and include teachers' assessment, judgmentals, in the official, which is standardized, evaluation of student performance. However, this changed the natures of the school-based assessment, considering that the various assessment programs have different purposes. For example, to assess performance officially, which is standardized. Combining this assessment compound their purpose, leading to challenges as highlighted in your presentation. For students to be able to use assessment in learning, assessment should be free of judgment. Teacher assessment that is included in official evaluation should therefore be separate and clearly be labeled as such, as not to confuse students about the different purposes of the assessment. Interesting perspective on this school-based assessment and standardized assessment. Would you please address this, Dr. Rianzi?
Yes, I think this is really very interesting and meaningful question about the separating the teacher assessment and the public standardized examination. Okay, back to the very original design of the SBA in Hong Kong. The reason why we introduced SBA into the HKDSE is that we found the one-off paper-based HKDSE examination. In many cases, they cannot capture the student's ability, especially in some subjects, they cannot capture the student's ability in some particular aspects. For example, the oral language skill, okay? The ability to conduct a project, the ability they can to do in a presentation, for example, in the general study, which is a very core subjects. So to solve this problem, we want to make this whole assessment a more authentic one. That means we can collect the evidence of the students' performance from different sources. Okay, one is from the public examination, another one is from the school-based performance. So by combining these different sources of information about the students' performance, we hope to provide a more comprehensive and more valid evaluation of the students' ability. However, as you point out, as well as highlight in my presentation, this kind of school-based assessment will become a little bit strange in the real implementation, because especially in the culture such as Hong Kong, we put so much emphasis on the summative assessment. Once the students understand that, okay, this school-based project will be marked and will be accounted for my final grades in the HKDSE, they will treat it as a summative assessment, not as a learning task. Okay, so to this end, some scholar or some teacher will say, actually the student stress have been increased rather than be reduced. However, one advantage we do achieve is that by including the school-based assessment, we do have a relatively more comprehensive picture about the student's performance. Okay, we have a more understanding about each student's capacity in doing presentation, in doing the teamwork, or whatever aspects which is important in a particular subject. So to that end, I think the SBA is a good attempt. But in terms of reduce the student stress, reduce the teacher workload, I don't think SBA can achieve those goals. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Yansi. I think this also somehow relevant to what Dr. Watson presented, because in England, there's also a national assessment and also teachers assessment. And the performance was reported at national level and also at regional levels. What do you have to say about this, Dr. Watson?
Yeah, so we obviously have used teacher assessment and tests over many years, and in the past there have been calls to try and combine them in some way, in a similar way to talked about there in Hong Kong. In the end, we've not gone with that system. We've only reported a test or a teacher assessment. And where children have done both, where they have done a nationally set test, but then that is used to inform, as part of the evidence, to inform the teacher assessment judgment, what we found is that parents found it difficult to understand when there were differences between the assessment that the teacher gave and the assessment that the test or the outcome from the test. And that was particularly confusing, just understanding that, yes, they're different assessments. They can give you different outcomes, but we found that actually it was better to combine them in those places, or to report them separately and only have a test or a teacher assessment, depending on which subject we are looking at.
Okay, thank you. Now I think we come in the interest of time because I think we are close to 5 p.m. I apologize if there's any question that uh, cannot be addressed in the sessions, but I will use this remaining time and give the floor to each of the presenters for maybe some summaries, some high point that need to be emphasized, or even some important message to the audience. Please first, Dr. Silimangalam.
Thank you, Dr. Warner. So the essential takeaway from my presentation was that the assessment in India is extremely complex, and I think there was quite a bit of progress being made, and I think there is more awareness and understanding of its benefits, but the challenges remain not quite insurmountable, but quite high. But I think there is, especially within the South Asian region, there is more awareness of how useful these national assessments are. And I think more and more countries are moving towards doing a more professional job with them. And so I think the large-scale standardized assessments in South Asia will, I think they'll get better and better.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yanzi.
Okay, to me, I think the standardized large-scale assessment is very important tools to enhance the education quality and to make the quality assurance in the educational system. However, as I said at the very beginning, I think there are many misconceptions and misuse of the assessment data. So the big challenge for the standardized large-scale assessment is to find an appropriate way based on the understanding of the local context in terms of how to appropriately optimize the use of the assessment data for the intended purpose, no matter for summative or for formative purposes. So that's the most important thing. We need to think, and the scholars, practitioners need to explore the way out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Yanzi. Dr. Watson?
So I think it follows on from what Dr. Yanzi said there. I think purpose is understanding your purpose, being very clear about what you are trying to achieve, designing an assessment to do that thing, but not allow it to be used for other purposes for which it can't support the inferences that are being made. And I think that's really important. I think policymakers often want to use, because they have some data, they just want to use it for everything. And actually, we need to be very clear what it is we're doing these large-scale national assessments for, and therefore how the data can be used and interpreted to make sure we're making valid judgments about whether that's policy decisions or what happens for an individual pupil. We need to make sure that we're really focused on what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much to all of our distinguished speakers today. We almost come to an end of this webinar. I'm not going to sum up all of the question answers and also the presentations. I just got an impression that large-scale standardized assessment is with us and it still will be with us, but it is not without a challenge to get a valid data for policy decisions, because some issues are mentioned, among others the perceptions, wrong perception, misperception on the assessment, and then also teaching to the test, and also a high-stake perspective on all the assessment in whatever the assessment, and also that will put a threat on the validity of the result. Many other technical challenges also exist. Well, I mean, the moral of the story is that we have worked hard, but we need to work harder on this large-scale and standardized assessment. Okay, dear participants, all ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, as mentioned earlier, we're going to close this webinar, but as mentioned earlier, this webinar is part of what's so-called Road to ICAL, which ICAL is the International Conference on Assessment and Learning. We may continue this discussion on the ICAL that will be held in Bali, Indonesia on October 13 to October 15. I personally myself have visited the venue, quite beautiful and very nice area. And we have prepared fruitful, rewarding keynotes and panel sessions. All the prominent figures in educational assessment, and we also have some curated workshop prior to the conference. So please register yourself. We have on the screen, you see that's the the keynote speakers, Andrea Sealers, who was also responsible for the PISA or involved in the PISA study. Jeff Masters, we know him. He's also the, I think, one of the prominent figure in psychometrics, and John Hattie. This is also an educational measurement, international figures. And on the floor, on the screen, also a polls. Please provide us with a feedback for the next webinar on the road to ICAL. With that, I would like to thank all the speakers, all the audience, all the colleagues for this very interesting sharing session, webinar. Hopefully, we learn from each other. And thank you again for all of the speakers, for Dr. Kelly Mangalan, Dr. Yancy, and Dr. Colin Watson for spending your valuable time to be with us this afternoon. Thank you. I'll return the floor to the host of the master ceremony.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ure Purwono. And of course, it was an interesting and insightful session by all of the speakers. And it was such an honor to get insight on summative and diagnostic educational assessment from all the speakers today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up today's event. On behalf of this webinar and also the ICAL committee, we would like to thank you all once again for attending today's event. It has been a pleasure to host this event, and we wish you a pleasant day. My name is Putri, and thank you.